Someone once said that every morning, the only sure thing any of us can say about the day that awaits us is that God's love arrived here before us. For the providential care of God for his children always rises long before the sun. The only sure thing every day, that God's loving care is running ahead of us, awaiting us each day. This is something of what I'd like to talk about this morning. In our text today, we pick things up where we left off last week. Moses, now 80 years old, is hiding out in the land of Midian, and God comes to him and calls him to return to Egypt to lead the people of Israel out of captivity and into freedom. The question now being whether or not Moses will accept this call, and at this point, this is still very much a big question. As we noted last week, having received this visit from God and the command to return to Egypt, Moses' basic response from the get-go is that he just wants out of the whole thing. He wants nothing to do with it. Like a lot of folks down through the centuries, when they receive a call from their church's nominating committee, Moses' whole focus thus far has been to try to work his way out of the thing, okay? In fact, between our reading last week and our reading this week, the entire last chapter and a half has been spent with Moses coming up with all sorts of excuses and explanations as to why he can't serve, all of which God has had a counter-argument against, an answer to. So in our text today, Moses takes one last shot at avoiding this call to lead the people. He offers his final reason as to why he can't possibly serve in this way, namely, that he's not a good speaker. But Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." Now, there's something odd about the world's fastest talking preacher delivering that line, but anyway, there's some question as to whether or not Moses had a problem, perhaps with stuttering or some other speech impediment. But whatever, basically, he's trying to get out of a leadership role due to one of the most common of all human phobias, namely the fear of public speaking. As comedian Jerry Seinfeld once observed, studies show that by far the number one fear in America is the fear of speaking in public, a distant second being the fear of death. Therefore, it only stands to reason that at any given funeral, most of the people present would rather be the corpse than the one giving the eulogy. God has called Moses to a great task, but our hero is running scared. The fear of public speaking has him terrified. But God has a solution. Finally comes up with it. Moses' brother Aaron, he's eloquent, he's a good speaker. Hey, Moses, why not let him do the talking for you? It's perfect. And it's a demonstration of how God tries to work with us, sort of improvising as we go. And even more, in God's offering of this simple solution, there's one tiny little detail in the text that particularly caught my attention. It's verse 14, and God says to Moses, "What of your brother Aaron, the Levite? I know that he can speak fluently, and even now he is coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, his heart will be glad. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. He indeed shall speak for you to the people. He shall serve as a mouth for you." Aaron will do the official public speaking for Moses, and as God says here, even now he is coming out to meet you. Think about that. Even now he is coming out to meet you. It's a little detail with profound repercussions. God is essentially saying that he already has Aaron on the way, right? That before God had even come to Moses, before Moses had ever even agreed to even entertain this call, God had already gotten Aaron on the way to go help him, right? God has been working at providing what Moses would need before Moses even knew that he needed it, right? The fulfillment of which we see just a few verses later. Aaron, moved by the Holy Spirit, has come out into the wilderness to find his long-lost brother Moses, and they rejoice in seeing one another after 40 years apart. All from a simple line, 9 simple words that speak volumes. Even now, he is coming out to meet you. Here, God is showing Moses that how he will provide and is providing for all his needs. And in so doing, he's offering the same to us, showing us how, when we face seemingly overwhelming obstacles, how God is providing for us. What do we learn here? Well, a few thoughts regarding God's provision for us in times of need. First, God knows what we need before we ask. Obviously, the first thing that drives our text here this morning is, as mentioned, that God has been active providing for Moses' needs before Moses even knew that he needed them. Actually, long before he needed them. God got Aaron moving ahead of time. And that's the first great lesson for us all here. When we are in need, God is moving ahead of time. God knows what we need before we ask. God is moving people. God is moving things into place to help us long before we may even know that we need the help. We may not be able to see this, but I believe that the first thing this text is trying to get us to do is to trust in this, to live this kind of confidence daily, Each of us to know that whenever I face some overwhelming, terrifying situation, God is somehow there ahead of me. God knows what I need and is providing it. What I need is somehow already there. I need only look around, right? One author writes, "After months of asking, I finally decided to repair the roof on my mother-in-law's patio. We made a material list, and my wife came with me to Home Depot to buy the supplies. In order to repair the roof, I would need 2x4s about 14 feet in length, and I purchased these along with the other supplies we needed, and I pushed the cart out to my pickup truck. I loaded the material into the truck and proceeded to strap down the 2x4s on the roll bar, but I had difficulty in securing the long boards. It seemed that no matter how I tied the boards down, they would slip lengthwise through the straps. After several attempts at different methods, frustration began to set in. But I realized that if I just put a nail through the strap and into the 2x4s, that they would not slip. I began to go through my truck looking for a nail, any nail. I looked in my toolbox and my glove box and behind the seat. I looked everywhere and did not find a single nail. That's unusual because I'm always doing something that requires a nail, and I always seem to have some around. Frustration began to creep in. I didn't want to do this project in the first place, and now this annoyance, right? My well-known temper began to take hold. What's the problem? My wife asked. I just need a stupid nail, I snapped. I can't believe I'm going to have to go back into the store and buy a whole box of nails just for this. With that, my wife said, will this do? And she proceeded to take out of her pocket a rusty old roofing nail. Where did you get that? I asked. She replied, well, as we came out of the store, I noticed it on the ground. I didn't want anybody to run over it and get a flat tire, so I picked it up. I didn't see a garbage can, so I figured I'd just throw it away when we got home. Well, the roofing nail she picked up would work just fine. It was old and rusted and slightly bent, but that did not prevent it from doing its job. Greatly humbled, in just a few seconds, the nail was driven home and the boards were secure. Without complications, without trials, without the fanfare of problem solving, with just a few short strokes of a hammer, all my problems were solved. God had supplied my needs in the store and as we left the store. He supplied my needs that day as my wife picked up that rusty nail. Before I even knew I needed a nail, God had supplied it. It was lying right there waiting for me. Today, that rusty nail has a place of honor in my wife's china hutch. It is there to remind me that God is always reaching out to supply my needs ahead of time if I will just relax, quit flipping out, and just look around. Thought number one in regarding God's provision for us, quit flipping out and just look around. That is, God knows what we need before we ask. Thought number two, God moves in a mysterious way. You know, there's an old story that is told of a man and his father who were out walking one day, and the man was bemoaning all the problems in his life, and especially how God didn't seem to be doing anything to help him. Finally, questioning God's wisdom and the whole arrangement of the universe that seemed totally against him, the man said, God doesn't even seem to know what he's doing. And the father asked, what do you mean? And the man pointed to a tree, and he replied, well, look at this giant tree over here. It gives forth only tiny acorns. While over here, pointing to a garden, this tiny plant gives forth huge watermelons. It doesn't make sense. Just then an acorn fell out of the tree and hit the man on the head. He looked upward, annoyed, and as he did so, his father tapped him on the shoulder and said, son, thank God that wasn't a watermelon. Right? God knows what is best, and even if it doesn't always seem to make immediate sense to us. And this is the basis for our second point here, Obviously, in the text, God provides for Moses' need, but it's not exactly what Moses wanted, what he had requested. In fact, it's not at all what Moses had requested. Moses, he wanted out entirely, right? But God refused that request. What God instead did was provide a way for Moses to fulfill the difficult challenge he had been called to, and thus be part of far greater blessings. Second lesson here, God provides for our needs, but not necessarily in the way that we desire or request. Sometimes God gives us exactly what we desire. Sometimes God gives us nothing of what we desire. In fact, sometimes he may even give us exactly the opposite of what we want. What doesn't make us happy may even hurt a little bit, but doesn't take us out of the hardship, but instead takes us through it. And we need to realize that God knows what is best and is always working on the greatest possible blessing for us and giving us that. How are we so insistent on what we're demanding that we're missing the greater thing that God is giving? Because on first glance, it goes against what we want. God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. You ever heard that saying? It comes from a poem. It was later made into a hymn by author William Cowper, and the story behind the poem is interesting. William Cowper was a Christian, and he lived in England in the 18th century. And he often suffered from bouts of severe depression. Well, in 1772, after a series of tragedies, he had sunk into the depths of despair. And one foggy night, he called for a horse-drawn carriage, and he asked to be taken to London Bridge on the Thames River. And he was so overcome with his depression that he intended to commit suicide there. But after 2 hours of driving through the deep mist, Cowper's coachman reluctantly confessed that he was lost, right? Disgusted by the delay and cursing this inept coachman who couldn't even find London Bridge, Cowper left the carriage and he decided to complete the trip on foot. After walking only a short distance, though, he suddenly came to a building, and he looked up and he realized that it was his own house. The carriage driver had been wandering in circles. Immediately, Cowper recognized the restraining hand of God in it all, God had worked to save him by sending him the very thing that he had been cursing. He wanted a good carriage driver, so God sent him an inept one, right? For the first time in many months, Cowper actually laughed. And in his gratitude, he sat down and he wrote these words. God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Deep in unfathomable mines of never-failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessing on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence he hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. Don't simply look for what you want. Look better for how God may be at work on a far greater blessing in what you don't want, right? And open your heart to its challenges and gifts. Thought number 2 regarding God's provision for us in time of need. God moves in a mysterious way. And then finally, thought number 3, God works through people. In the end, notice how God solves Moses' problem of poor speaking skills, not by, snapping his fingers and magically making Moses eloquent, not by sending him a voice coach, to improve his speaking skills, but rather by sending his brother. God sends him Aaron to help him. Notice also how, in turn, how Moses becomes the answer to Aaron's problems. Aaron, living in slavery, Moses was going to be the way out. In both cases, reciprocally, God answers need through people. And this is the final lesson here. God works through people. That is, yes, occasionally God miraculously plunks down in our lives something that we need. But more often than not, God provides for us by drawing us into contact with people, bringing people into our lives, bringing us to them, where what we need appears, It is in getting in contact with people that God's provision best arrives, most especially as in our text today. It is in each person seeking to be a blessing for another that they both receive the provision that they both need. Final point, simply put, in seeking God's provision for yourself, most especially in times of overwhelming need, get out beyond yourself. Seek contact. Get involved. Strive to give to another, and they will give to you. A noted Christian author writes, "It was chilly in Manhattan, but warm inside the Starbucks on 51st Street and Broadway, just a skip up from Times Square. Early November weather in New York City holds only the slightest hint of the bitter chill of late December and January, but it's enough to send the masses crowding indoors to vie for available space and warmth. For a musician, it's the most lucrative Starbucks location in the world, so I'm told, and consequently the tips can be substantial if you play your tunes right. Apparently, we were striking all the right chords that night because our basket was almost overflowing. It was a fun, low-pressure gig. I was playing keyboard and singing backup for my friend, who also added rhythm with an arsenal of percussion instruments. We mostly did pop songs from the 40s to the 90s, with a few original tunes thrown in. During our emotional rendition of the classic, If You Don't Know Me By Now, I noticed a lady sitting in one of the lounge chairs across from me, swaying to the beat, and she was singing along. After the tune was over, she approached me. "I apologize for singing along on that song. Did it bother you?" she asked. "No," I replied. We love it when the audience joins in, especially when someone has a great voice like yours. Would you like to sing up front on the next selection?" To my delight, she accepted the invitation. "Choose a song," I said. What are you in the mood to sing?" "Well, do you know any hymns?" she inquired. Hymns? This woman didn't know who she was dealing with. I had cut my teeth on hymns. Before I was even born, I was going to church. I gave our guest singer a knowing look. "Name one," I said. "Oh, I don't know," she answered. "There's so many good ones, you pick one." "Okay," I replied. "How about His Eye is on the Sparrow?" My friend was silent, and her eyes averted for a moment. Then she fixed her eyes on mine again. She said, "Yeah, let's do that one." And she put down her purse, straightened her jacket, and faced the center of the shop. With my 2-bar setup, she began to sing the opening line of the hymn. "Why should I be discouraged? Why should the shadows come?" The audience of coffee drinkers suddenly dropped what they were doing, and they were transfixed. Even the gurgling noises of the cappuccino machine ceased as employees stopped what they were doing to listen. It was great. The song rose to its concluding chorus. "I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. For His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me." When the last note was sung, the applause crescendoed to a deafening roar that would have rivaled a sold-out crowd at Carnegie Hall. Embarrassed, the woman tried to shout over the noise, "Oh, you all just go back to your coffee. I didn't come in here to do a concert. I just came in here to get something to drink just like the rest of you." But the ovation continued. I embraced my new friend. "You, my dear, have made my whole year. That was fantastic." "Well, it's funny that you picked that particular hymn," she said. "Why's that?" I asked. "Well," she hesitated again, "that was my daughter's favorite song." "Oh, really?" I exclaimed. "Yes," she said, and then she grabbed my hands. By this time, the applause had subsided, and it was business as usual, and the woman said to me, she continued, "My daughter was 16, and she died of a brain tumor last week." I said the first thing that found its way through my stunned silence, "Are you going to be okay?" And she smiled through tear-filled eyes and squeezed my hands again. "I'm going to be more than okay," she said. "God's sending me you, and that song was Him telling me that." And with that, she picked up her bag and she left. Was it just a coincidence that we happened to be singing in that particular coffee shop on that particular November night? Coincidence that this wonderful lady just happened to walk into that particular shop? Coincidences that of all the hymns to choose from, I just happened to pick the very hymn that was the favorite of her daughter who had died just a week before? I refuse to believe it. God has been arranging encounters in human history since the beginning of time, and it is no stretch for me to imagine that He could reach into a coffee shop in Midtown Manhattan and turn an ordinary gig into a revival meeting. It was a great reminder that if we keep trusting Him and singing His songs and reaching out to the people that come our way, everything is going to be more than okay. Get out, get involved in the lives of people. Every morning, the only sure thing that any of us can say about the day that awaits us is that God's love arrived there before us. For the providential care of God for His children always rises long before the sun. When, like Moses, your life before you seems to be overwhelming, let God provide for your needs as He did all those years ago. Remember, God knows what you need before you ask. God moves in a mysterious way, and God works through people. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn. It's in the faith we sing, hymnal number 2146, His Eye is on the Sparrow. Would you please stand?